In 2021, the state enacted the New York Health and Essential Rights Act, aka the NY HERO Act, which was designed, based on the experience with COVID 19, to increase workplace health and safety protections from current and future airborne infectious diseases. Based on this law, the State Department of Labor developed model safety plans that employers could choose from, or they could implement their own plans if they met state minimum standards. Additionally, the measure paved the way for workers to create workplace safety committees. To discuss the implementation of this law, as well as legislation approved in June that would strengthen the employee protections in the law, we're joined by the Senate Deputy Majority Leader, Mike Gianaris, a Queens Democrat who has championed this issue. Welcome back to the show, Senator.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
So, you sponsored a bill that was approved at the end of the legislative session that is designed to ensure employees are able to form workplace safety committees. What prompted this addition to your 2021 law?
Well, let's unpack this for a second, if
Sure.
you don't mind. The original HERO Act did two things. It said in a time of a declared danger due to an airborne infectious disease, which obviously we were in, and it requires the governor's declaration, which we received under Governor Hochul, there are requirements that every workplace has to abide by to maintain the safety of the workplace for their employees. Regardless of that declaration and when that declaration expired, there is still the ongoing requirement to recognize a workplace safety committee, which means a committee of employees to monitor safety in the workplace. So to make sure that the employers are complying with any requirements, to alert them to any dangers that the employees see or are experiencing. That is an ongoing requirement. Strangely, the Department of Labor did not recognize their role in enforcing that aspect of the law. So we had a number of instances where employers refused to recognize these committees that the law explicitly sanctions and requires them to recognize. So a number of us had contacted Dot Meredith, for example, who is one of the largest publishers of both digital and print publications, which refused to recognize their workers' efforts. Chipotle also had a location where they refused to recognize a workplace committee, where the law very clearly says they're required to do so. So we brought this to the attention of the Department of Labor, and they threw their hands up and said they don't intend to do anything about it because, who knows why. The law was pretty clear that they have the enforcement authority. But just to take that excuse away from them, we passed a law at the end of the session that explicitly made clear that the Department of Labor has the responsibility and authority to enforce the recognition of workplace safety committees, and that law is now awaiting Governor Hochul's signature.
Did you find that there were any commonalities among the employers that were opting not to recognize these workplace safety committees that employees were looking to form, or was it as disparate as the two examples you just laid out?
It was pretty disparate, and I initially thought maybe it was just ignorance of the new requirements. This is a relatively new law that we passed. But what was really startling to me is we wrote to the employers, a number of legislators, myself especially, and said, here's a section of the law, here's what's required, your employees are abiding by it, you must recognize them. And they continued to ignore the requirements. So what I thought was initially just an ignorance of the law was clearly thumbing their nose at the law that we passed. And then, of course, what do you do in that circumstance? You ask the responsible agency to take enforcement action against them. And when we went to the Department of Labor, they refused, which is really unfortunate. I mean, you would think the Department of Labor's job is to make sure that employees are being treated fairly in their workplaces. But in this case, I don't know if it was poor lawyering at the agency or what have you, but they did not want to recognize their responsibility, so we are making it more explicit, assuming the governor signs the bill.
Well, speaking of awareness of the law, do you feel like employees around the state are familiar with their ability under this law to form workplace safety committees, or does more need to be done either by the Department of Labor or legislative champions of this issue like yourself to make sure that New Yorkers are cognizant of the fact that this is something that they can do in their workplace?
Yeah, I think education is required. This, like I said earlier, this is a relatively new development in New York State. and nation leading in its scope. So we do need to educate workers about their rights. Uh, Certainly, legislators, the Department of Labor, yes. But what we're seeing is organized labor is playing a very large role, as they should, in telling the workers they represent that they have these powers, or even if they don't represent them, just getting the word out to workers that they have this power now to stand up for themselves in the workplace. The Chipotle I mentioned, 32BJ, was very involved in organizing those workers or helping them fight an employer who didn't want to recognize their existence. And TWA has been very involved. So we're seeing a lot of organized labor step in to help the workers assert their rights.
So, in the wake of the HERO Act becoming a law in 2021, there was some accusations of the Cuomo administration and the Hochul administration dragging their feet on declaring COVID-19 a highly contagious communicable disease pursuant to the HERO Act and the special distinction with which that language would mean moving forward under the HERO Act. Do you feel like this is a process moving forward where the health officials and the Hochul administration or whoever is running the state are in a good place to call for these, distinctions, these highly contagious communicable disease distinctions, or does there need to be other metrics that are I guess, less subjective to ensure that the airborne threats are recognized maybe automatically, some sort of thresholds or other triggers, as opposed to leaving it up to, humans?
Well, Dave, it may not surprise you to learn that Andrew Cuomo did not like any ideas that weren't his. And so when the legislature took the lead in passing this law, he did drag his feet in recognizing. Now, mind you, when Andrew Cuomo was governor, we were in the midst of COVID in a way that was much more severe than we're dealing with today. And I kept asking them, well, if you're not recognizing that at that time we are in the midst of a highly infectious communicable disease, when will you ever recognize it? But they never did. In fact, I do want to give Governor Hochul credit where credit is due. Pretty quickly after she became governor, she did issue that declaration, and seems to be very aware of the need for this approach, which is why I'm hopeful she will sign this law and make sure that her agencies take action against employers who are ignoring the legal requirements.
Well, in March of this year, the designation of COVID-19 as an airborne infectious disease was removed. It was ended, if you will, but we're still living under a COVID-19 state of emergency. So, do you think that was the right move to end that distinction 6 months ago?
I'm not going to second guess experts in the administration as to the timing of that. As I mentioned, I believe Governor Hochul is acting in good faith as she interprets this law, and we're obviously going to be living with COVID apparently forever. It seems to have reached an endemic stage, much like the flu. So obviously, those requirements are not intended to live on in perpetuity. What is supposed to live on in perpetuity is the process points where workers get to band together and raise these concerns with their employers, and that's why the new law adjusting or making clear the Department of Labor's authority is necessary, unfortunately.
Well, for listeners just joining us, you're listening to the Capitol Pressroom, and we're speaking with Senate Deputy Majority Leader Mike Gianaris, a Queens Democrat. So I want to pivot over to the election side of things, and your capacity as head of the Democratic Senate's election efforts. And I believe every Democratic incumbent senator with a primary in August, whether they were challenged from the far left or the center of the party, held on and is going to be on the ballot in November. So what does it mean to you to have all the incumbents, if I'm correct, win their primaries?
Well, it was a validation by voters of the work we're doing in the majority. I mean, that's the way I look at it. When you see incumbents across the spectrum be returned as nominees of their party, it tells you that, in some sense, there was a referendum on our majority in all its forms, and across the board, we saw that voters want us to continue in the direction we're going. What was especially interesting to me is, while yes, there were primaries from all sides, there was a concerted effort and an organized effort to defeat some of our more progressive members. I'm thinking of Gustavo Rivera and Robert Jackson, and even in the open seat, which comprises part of my current district, where Kristen Gonzalez ended up emerging victorious. There were the usual forces, and I like to say it's like the old forces that caused mayhem in the Senate for a decade before we took the majority, that were once again trying to divide our conference and subvert the Democratic Senate. And those challenges were resoundingly defeated. And hopefully people are getting the message that the public has faith in the Democratic leadership and Andre Stewart Cousins and myself and the rest of our members. And best to try to work with us and subvert the direction we're going.
When you think about the upcoming November elections, how much of the future of the state Senate is dependent on the top of the ticket and national trends, and how much can your individual candidates and the individual messaging and just the work that the Senate has done under Democratic leadership for the last 4 years actually influence everything? I mean, is there a limit to how much you guys can do and how much your hands are just tied?
Sure. It's always a combination of those factors. And I like to think of it, having chaired the campaign committee for over a decade now. The overlay is the national dialogue and the broader dialogue. But then in the districts who we refer to as the competitive or the marginal districts, that when the margins are that close, it is inevitably a result of the individual candidates and a referendum on the Senate itself and the leadership of the Senate. And so we try very hard. We work incredibly hard, expend a great amount of resources to run these campaigns. We've done it very successfully, sitting with the largest majority the state's ever had. But it's in those districts which typically end up outside the city of New York, right? Long Island, the northern suburbs, the upstate cities, et cetera, where the political battles are engaged in the next 2 months that determine the fate of the Senate. But when you're winning races by 2%, 3%, 4%, that is not just the national trends that are guiding those contests. Yes, in places where they're so blue you're pulling in 70 or 80% of the vote, or so red that the other side is doing that, that's probably irrelevant of what specific things are happening in Albany. But when you get into these close contests, it makes a huge difference.
Well, finally, the special election victory by Ulster County Executive Pat Ryan in the 19th Congressional District has been heralded as this great omen for Democrats heading into November, which is supposed to be a red wave year, considering the White House is controlled by the Democrats, so is the Congress. And when I look at the results from that, it's a 2-point win for Pat Ryan compared to a 12-point victory by Democrat Antonio Delgado in 2020, which was also a good year for Republicans, down the ballot on those congressional races around the country. So if I'm looking at a 10-point Republican swing, does that mean that there are going to be competitive races from 2020, say that were within a 10-point Democratic margin, where those incumbents should be afraid, based on that swing? Or am I reading too much into this special election?
Can I say both things are true?
Sure.
I think we're all reading too much into a late August election that was simultaneous with Democratic primaries, largely some of these areas. So the turnout affects the results probably more than anything else. Who comes out, who decides to stay home. And a late August primary was unprecedented. And so we're still analyzing who came out for that and what that means going forward. But I'm thrilled that Pat Ryan won, and I think it does indicate that the normal trends might be beaten back a little bit, because the Republicans at the national level have gone haywire, and rights that people have held for half a century are being stripped away summarily by an out-of-control Supreme Court. I think the voters are riled up about that, as they should be, and want to make sure they influence policy. And for us, the state level is more important than ever because we can expect, I'm afraid, the Supreme Court to be issuing more decisions that are taking away rights that we've come to expect federally, and will fall upon the states to ensure those rights for our residents. So I think voters are seeing that danger and coming out to hopefully buck a trend that is just a historical expectation that whenever a party holds the presidency, they do poorly in the midterm election.
Right.
So I think we've come, it worked against us in 2014, and in 2010, it worked for us in 2018. So we came into this cycle expecting it to be rough waters. It's one of the reasons we're so happy our majority is so big, that our majority in the Senate is not at risk. But nonetheless, we want to win as many races as we can and keep moving the state forward in the direction we've been going, and that requires us to win elections. And we'll do the best we can. What late August means for early November, who knows? We'll find out in less than 2 months. But all we can do is put our best foot forward and let the voters decide.
Well, we've been speaking with Senate Deputy Majority Leader Mike Gianaris. He is a Queens Democrat. Senator, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dave. Thank you.